Hello and welcome to my channel Psychiatric Detangled. I am Dr. Sabanji Sharma. Today we'll be talking about the psychological impact of this COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown that we are all invariably going through on the elderly population. The elderly as a group of population are the most affected in this pandemic because of a vast plethora of physiological function deteriorations that invariably happen our aging bodies. Elderly are also more vulnerable for the psychological breakdown or the impact of any kind of chronic stress, which is not yet been systematically studied in this COVID-19 pandemic because data are scarcely coming up to our hands. But the initial analysis or initial reviews, which are mainly based on this online surveys and the person who are convalescing from this COVID-19 pandemic, shows that the disorders of internalizing psychiatric disorders like the depressions, anxiety, and overall a sense of negative well-being is on the rise, and that more also in the elderly population. So, what factors make the elderly person more vulnerable to develop a psychological breakdown? First of all, we should remember that elderly as a group are the most resilient in face of any kind of acute stress. That is because they had accumulated years and years of wisdom, which is an amalgamation of knowledge and experience along with the practicability of the knowledge, which helps them sail through different stresses in life. But why then they are more vulnerable for a continuously going or a chronic stress like this COVID-19 pandemic? Some factors are important in this particular matter. First of all, we should know what is going on in the brains of the elderly. As persons age up, our brains are getting more and more vulnerable in terms of the circuitry that drives our brain's function. The uppermost layer of our brain, which we call the cortex, and the connection with the deeper parts of the brain nuclei, the cortical, subcortical connections, they are getting weakened by forces of nature. They are getting weakened by tiny hemorrhages, they are getting weakened by microinfarcts, they are getting weakened by degeneration of the protective layer around the nerve cells, which we call the neurolemma or the Schwann cell layers. So the connectivity between the higher cortical organizations and the lower, or the, as you can say, the workforce nuclei of our brain through which the primary work is distributed, are getting weakened by virtue of time. The elderly are more prone to develop an error in their judgment, error in their processing of the information that which we normally all process very smoothly, and as a matter of fact, they are more prone to have an error in the processing of information, which is called the information processing deficit hypothesis, which primarily happens because of this thing which I have said, that the defect in the communication between different parts of the brain. And the hallmark of the aging process in the elderly brain is the slowing of this process of information processing. It means an elderly person, given a similar amount of time to respond to a particular question as to a younger person, will take much longer time to answer or respond to the particular situation or particular question. It makes them more vulnerable for getting into some biases. The bias, like in this current situation, suppose the negative impact of the news, of the medium, of different sensation-seeking news mediums which are circulating everywhere in all the mediums, they are more able to put a negative impact on the elderly brain and the elderly mindset, because the time or the efficiency required to process all this kind of varying informations in our environment is reducing in our elderly brains. The second factor that we should also be aware about is that our body defense mechanism, as a particular kind of defense which is called an axis of different neurohormonal structures, like the most important one is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which generates ultimately the stress response cycle, which is driven by the hormone cortisol. That also is getting abnormally hiked up in case of the elderly population in face of a chronic stress. Elderly, as I have said previously, are much more efficient in processing an acute stress, which is very much evident by their being in this world for so many years. They have seen so much of devastations. They have seen so much of losses of their workforce, of their colleagues, of their spouse. But still, they are happy and smiling in face of all adversities. That is called resilience. Any kind of acute, that is suddenly happening bad news or bad event, cannot shatter them. But because of this increased activity of this hypothalamic pituitary axis, or the increased baseline level of this cortisol hormone, it takes a toll in their important brain structures when the stress is of a long-term duration. The most important one of is that the toll which it takes on the hippocampus. Hippocampus, as I said, is a structure deep inside our brain. If we say this is the brain, this is the cortex, this is deep inside our brain, which is a very important structure for memory consolidation. Whatever we are learning day to day, to consolidate that into our long-term memory storage, that particular structure is important. And this chronically increased level of cortisol hormone, it devastates the hippocampal neurons, the cells in the hippocampus. Their connections are getting pruned out. They are less capable of sending signals to interconnected regions of the brain. And most importantly, the new generation of new cells, which is very much important in these hippocampal areas, which is called neurogenesis, it is also affected by this increased level of hypothalamic pituitary axis activation and increased level of baseline cortisol. So what happens? The memory strengthening, or whatever we learn, whatever we are getting into our storage of information, to make them a long-term storage, that also gets deficient in the elderly. So what happens? They are more prone to develop kind of diseases like dementia or minor or major cognitive impairments, which is one of the most important focus in case of any kind of chronic stress. Because as I've said previously, elderly, as they age, they have deficits in information processing or slowness in information processing, which doesn't make them vulnerable for developing dementia or disease like cognitive impairment. But this kind of abnormality happening through this hippocampal neuronal architecture deformities can make them more vulnerable to go towards a tipping point where they can develop frank dementias or incapacitating cognitive abnormalities. Third point that we should know about is that the elderly are also having a much what we can say, that elderly, for them elderly, it is important to have a social communication, which is their major source of cognitive enhancement. That means to get mentally healthy, to be going around in our daily tasks and activities after retirement, after people who are staying at home not doing their works which they are supposed to be doing for last so many decades. To keep mentally healthy, what is the primary workforce for the elderly is a social communication. The social communication, which is so much important to the elderly as a cohort, as a group also, because they are from a different generation. Most of the people who are above the age of 60 years nowadays, they would be belonging to a group of people which is called cohort, which are born ages before our time. So the information, the bombardment of information, the broadcasting, the information processing technologies, the information consuming technologies, the technologies for communication, which are so handy to us and so ingrained in our daily habitual behaviors, that are alien to the elderly population. To get mentally healthy, to be mentally healthy for an elderly person, being physically present in a community, being physically able to communicate with their peers, being physically able to experience different emotions in their peers or in their own mindset, to see their colleagues laughing, to crack a joke together, to be happy in others' happiness, to be sad when someone else is having a sad face, that emotional reciprocity, which is very much important in a one-to-one manner for our elderly population, that is lacking to them naturally as they age. They are getting more desocialized, and the universal emphasis on social distancing is increasing this vulnerability for our elderly population. This is inevitable. We have to follow social distancing, but as I said in one of my previous videos, we have to make the alternative ways of socializing much more accessible to our elderly population. to make them aware about group chatting, FaceTime, WhatsApp, YouTube videos, and there to be able to navigate through different important consumable entertainment materials in the virtual web medium. We have to make them aware about that, and we have to make them take utmost benefit from this virtual medium, so that they can enjoy a uninterrupted social communication to make them mentally active and healthy. Along with that, we have to make our elderly engaged in different kind of cognitively stimulating activities, like we have to make them solve puzzles. We have to sit with them, because we have ample time now. We have to sit with them to play a game of chess, or we have to make them acquainted with playing Sudoku game of cards. We all have to play with them. Four of us sit with our elderly grandparents and all, and we crack a healthy joke and hearty laughter, along with sorting cards, which give them a must needed cognitive stimulation. Along with that, to engage in different kind of sensory stimulations, like specific amount of time devoted to hearing music, listening to music, singing if they like, then also painting, drawing, which is visual medium, then also seeing natural beauty, older memories through our older photo albums, video albums. We have to share with them. We have to make our time available for our elderly during this lockdown time to make them cognitively healthy. So this is in a gist what I want to convey today regarding the psychological vulnerability of our elderly population, although there are many more facets to this. So if you like my video, like it and share it to your friends and community, and also subscribe to my channel Psychiatric Detangled. Thank you.